We ended part 3 talking about ions, and ions are atoms that have become charged, and the way they become charged is by giving up an electron, and giving up an electron or donating electron to another atom is called oxidation. And in this case we used as an example sodium, and when it gave up that one negative charge, it had one more positive charge. Therefore sodium became a positive atom or positive ion, and we call that a cation. It gave up its electron here to chlorine, and as that chlorine atom gained one electron to fill its outermost valence shell, then it became an atom with one extra negative charge as compared to positive charges. So it gained an electron, so now it has 18 electrons and 17 protons. So it becomes a negative atom or a negative ion called an anion. And by the way, when that chlorine gained that electron, that's called reduction. So this is a redox reaction. Ionic bonds happens when a bond is formed when there is an attraction between a cation and an anion. It's formed when electrons are transferred from one atom to the other, or to another. Sodium was very volatile. It gave up its one electron in its valence shell. Now it has become stable, and it donated that electron to chlorine here. Now it becomes chloride, and a positive and a negative ion bonding together forms an ionic bond, a cation and an anion for an ionic bond. Covalent. Now when you see covalent, think of co-workers. Okay, covalent bonds are formed when the electron is shared. So covalent, think of share, like co-worker helps share the workload. So a covalent bond is when the electrons are shared. And we've talked about this before, that a hydrogen by itself is very volatile. It's explosive, actually. It'd blow up our atmosphere if we had single hydrogen atoms floating around in our atmosphere. So to fill its outermost valence shell, then it shares an electron with another hydrogen atom, and so we see H2 in our atmosphere. So hydrogen atoms form single bonds because it needs one more electron for a full valence shell. Oxygen needs 2 electrons, so it forms 2 bonds. Nitrogen needs 3, so it forms 3 bonds. And carbon needs 4, so it forms 4 bonds. So electrons are shared equally, and because they're shared equally, it's also called a non-polar covalent bond. Now polar covalent bonds, is when the molecule has a slightly negative and a slightly positive end. It results when electrons are not shared equally in the covalent bond. Water is an example of this. Okay, so here's our oxygen, and then water's H2O, so there's 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. Here's the 2 hydrogens to this 1 oxygen. Hydrogens give up their electrons very easily. They donate their electrons very easily, and oxygen, as we stated in the last slide, needs 2 electrons to have its valence shell filled up, and it holds on to those electrons. So this makes these hydrogens that have given up their electrons slightly positive because they have that 1 proton in the nucleus, and then the oxygen that's holding on to these extra electrons or negative charges would have a slightly negative end. Now we know this to be true because after you've waxed your car and it rains, if you have 2 raindrops close together, if they get very close, it almost seems like a magnet where they join to form a larger drop. And it causes on the surface of a small container some cohesiveness in the water, so that if you had a small cup of water, you could float a needle on top of it. Okay, and have you ever ran out of dishwashing soap or laundry detergent and you tried to run a load without the soap, and the clothes didn't get very clean and the dishes didn't get very clean? It's because the cohesiveness, the stickiness of these water molecules is pretty strong, so it doesn't allow, or it doesn't, the dirt molecules in between them are grease. So that's why your dishes don't get clean or your clothes don't get clean. But if you add a drop of soap to that little jar that has the needle floating on top, it breaks the bonds between the water molecules and that needle will sink to the bottom. If you add soap to the dishwasher or to the washing machine, it will break the bonds between this polar bond between the water molecules and allow the dirt to fit in between the water molecules or the grease, and it breaks that cohesiveness. And that action is, the soap is called a surfactant. When a premature baby is born, they have to, or the mother goes into labor prematurely, they'll do an amniocentesis and take a little amniotic fluid and see if the baby is producing surfactants so that the lungs do not collapse. In our lungs, we produce a surfactant because we have moisture in our lungs, and if we didn't produce a surfactant, our lungs would collapse or stick, the membranes would stick to one another and our lungs would collapse. The same thing happens in a premature baby because that's one of the last things to develop is the ability to produce surfactant that keeps the lungs from collapsing. So they try to prolong the pregnancy just a little bit longer if the mother goes into premature labor, if the surfactant is not being produced. And if the baby is born early, that's why it's put on a machine to help it to breathe until it starts producing that surfactant. It helps to break the bond between the water molecules or the fluid in the lungs. Now these are called structural formulas, also called chemical formulas. Here we have that 1 bond between 2 hydrogen atoms, 2 bonds between the oxygen, O2, and here H2O with 1 oxygen. And remember that it needed 2 bonds for that oxygen to have a full valence shell, and it shares unequally. These hydrogens easily give it up, and remember, to give it up is called oxidation, and when the electrons receive, when the oxygen receives the electrons, that is called reduction. So this is a redox reaction when you have the hydrogens bonding with the oxygen, H2O, and it needs 2 hydrogens to fill its valence electron, or valence shells with electrons. Okay, carbon needed 4 bonds, and so it takes 2 oxygens, 2 bonds to fill its outermost shell, 2 bonds to fill its outermost shell, so the oxygens will bond with carbon, so CO2, or carbon dioxide. So these are the molecular formula. This is a structural formula. Molecular formula, structural formula, how they're put together. Now look at this molecular formula for glucose. So that's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but 6 carbon atoms bonded with 12 hydrogen atoms and 6 oxygen atoms. Okay, because this has a 2-to-1 ratio, we know it's a carbohydrate, and it happens to be a monosaccharide, which means 1 simple sugar. And if we add a 2 in front of it, we have 2 molecules of glucose. So this number tells us how many of these molecules we have. So in 2 molecules of glucose, we would have 2 times 6, 12 carbons, 2 times 12, 24 hydrogens, 2 times 6, 12 oxygens. Hydrogen bonds. What's special about hydrogen bonds is they are easily formed and easily broken because there's a weak attraction between the positive end, a polar molecule, one polar molecule, and the negative end of another polar molecule. We talked about that a few minutes ago. It's formed between water molecules. It's important for protein and nucleic acid structures. And not just in water molecules, but in joining 2 amino acids together for a protein. They're bonded with the hydrogen atom, and those hydrogen bonds are easily broken. As we eat protein in our diet, it's broken down into a polypeptide, to a dipeptide, to a single amino acid, so that we can use those amino acids to build the other proteins that we need in our body. And that happens, the breaking down of that protein, or breaking down more complex carbohydrates, is basically a matter of a lot of times breaking hydrogen bonds for DNA to be replicated and RNA to be made. These simple hydrogen bonds are broken, and then for them to be replicated or made, the hydrogen bonds are important in forming new bonds or new parts to make a new strand of DNA that's semi-conservative that we'll talk about later, or RNA. It's all about those hydrogen bonds that are easily formed and easily broken. They're weaker. Hydrogen bonds are weaker than covalent bonds, but essential for life. They help to stabilize the 3D shapes of larger molecules. Proteins have a 3D shape, and if you break those hydrogen bonds, if you alter or denature the protein, it affects the function of that protein. It may make it useless, or it may make it into a different type of protein. But just altering that 3D shape is a matter of breaking the hydrogen bonds and maybe reforming them. But hydrogen bonds are very important in biology. Chemical reactions. Chemical reactions occur when chemical bonds form or break among atoms, ions, and molecules. Reactants are substances being changed by the chemical reaction. The products are substances formed at the end of a chemical reaction. And we've already talked about how sodium chloride is formed, but here's the breakdown of sodium chloride into sodium and chloride. And remember that that one electron that sodium had in its valence shell is now gone, so this sodium is safe, and that chlorine that received the electron, this became an anion, this one became a cation, a cation and anion, positively charged ion and a negatively charged ion. When this one received the electron, it became negatively charged, and it became stable because now its full valence shell is full, and this one gave up that one, so it has a full valence shell, and it stabilized these. Now look at the direction this arrow is pointing. The arrow always points toward the product, and the arrow always points toward the product. So this is the reactant and this is the product. Types of chemical reactions. In a synthesis reaction, two components bond to make a larger molecule. Two smaller to a larger. Energy is required and is stored in the bond. Okay, so synthesis reaction involves the formation of a larger, more complex molecule. It's very important. Dehydration synthesis, water molecules form. These dehydration synthesis, you have in the reaction, you'll have water in the products. So these water molecules are formed in dehydration synthesis. And the synthesis reaction is important for the growth of new body parts. And it is endothermic. So the bonding here happens with the help of energy. So when this bond is formed, it's called endothermic because it requires energy. But what's good about this is that energy is then stored in this more complex, larger molecule. So it endothermic because it requires energy. And also it is anabolism. Anabolism is the building of something and the storing of energy. Anabolism, synthesis reaction, the building of a more complex from simpler. It takes energy, then that more complex molecule is storing that energy. Anabolism, and endothermic. Now, decomposition reaction, bonds between the components of larger molecules are broken, resulting in smaller products. So you have a large, more complex molecule. It has that energy stored inside of it. And when it breaks down, it releases that energy, so we call that exothermic. We also call it, because it releases that energy, catabolism. Anabolism builds, stores energy. Catabolism releases the energy. When decomposition happens, breaks the bonds within the larger molecules to form smaller atoms, ions, and molecules, releases energy, so it's exothermic. It's a common type, and an example would be hydrolysis. Hydrolysis. Hydro, water to lyse, break apart. So in this part of the reaction, you have to have water, and it helps to break this molecule down. So it's called hydrolysis, hydrolysis. Ionic components of water are added to the products. All decomposition reactions in an organism is called catabolism. So in humans, especially the nervous system, it likes to break down carbohydrates, and glucose is its favorite, into simpler substances to release the energy, and so it can use the energy. And then ATPs are our energy currency. An ATP is broken down into an ADP and a phosphate. Okay, then we have an exchange reaction. Bonds are formed, and so that would be anabolism, and then they're broken, and the reactants are rearranged, and so we have catabolism and anabolism. We have decomposition and synthesis. It involves breaking and forming covalent bonds. It involves endothermic and exothermic steps. The atoms move from one molecule to another, trading places. And a good example would be like, okay, so this couple goes to a dance, and this along with this other couple, and during one dance they decide to switch partners, and so you have two different partners made up from the two original dance couples. The sum of all chemical reactions in an organism is called metabolism. The sum of all chemical reactions in an organism is called metabolism. Okay, synthesis reactions. So here we go. Synthesis chemical bonds are formed. Again, it is endothermic, so you have the simpler to the more complex, and then the more complex you have stored energy. It's also anabolic. Decomposition reaction, chemical bonds are broken, and it's catabolic. Energy is released, so it's exothermic. When you have these bonded together, you have stored energy, and when those bonds break, that energy is released, so we call that catabolism. And an exchange reaction, again, here are those two dance couples, and they decide to switch partners. The chemical bonds are broken and then formed again, so you have endothermic, then exothermic steps, or you have synthesis to decomposition. Now remember, the direction of the arrow is, it always points to the product. You have catabolic and then anabolic. They're breaking apart, releasing energy, and then energy is stored as these new molecules are formed. A reversible reaction, the products can change back to the reactants. Here we have A plus B forms AB. We had Na plus Cl, remember, sodium chloride, and if the arrow, it looks like this, it means it's reversible. Sometimes you have an arrow pointing toward the product and then back toward the reactants, and you can draw it in a couple of different ways, but that means that it is reversible. So your product can become the reactant, and the reactant can become the product. Reversible. Now, factors that influence the rate of chemical reactions. Temperature. It's related to the tendency of the molecules to collide. They must collide to react. As temperature rises, reaction rate also increases or rises. It's true in the non-living world as well as the living. Now we know this because we put a fire under our water and eventually that water is going to boil. So then we have the release of those water molecules. You're breaking bonds and the water molecules are jumping off the surface of that water and joining with air molecules, and over at that window those air molecules with that water attached forms condensation because temperature drops and the water droplets reform. The particle size, smaller particles tend to react faster, they move more. The concentration of a substance can influence the reaction rate. A catalyst. Catalysts are interesting in living systems. They're very important. They're substances that increase the rate of chemical reactions. But what's interesting about catalysts is that they do not become chemically part of the products in the reaction. Now, enzymes are an example of a catalyst. We need enzymes, and the enzymes are usually proteins that are catalysts that will either speed up a reaction, cause a reaction to happen, and those protein enzymes are very important for a lot of reactions that happen in our body, in our physical body.